Good afternoon. Wow, that was loud. I think I'm louder than Kristine is. I want to welcome you. My name is Terry Fees. I'm Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at CU Boulder. This is our 113th Distinguished Research Lecture, and the Distinguished Research Lectureship is one of the most significant honors awarded each academic at CU Boulder. It's also one of the most exciting events. I know if many of you have attended some of the other ones, it's always very interesting. And today you're in for a special treat. And I did want to point out that Kristine has her support team of women engineers all supporting Kristine. So yeah, all right. So to kind of kick this off, I'd like to introduce Russ Moore, who will tell us a little bit more before we have the introduction for Kristine.
Thank you, Terry. The Distinguished Research Lectureship is amongst the highest honors that a faculty at CU Boulder can bestow on a fellow faculty member. This honor recognizes a faculty member who has demonstrated world-class contributions in teaching, research, and professional leadership. It acknowledges a faculty leader whose positive impact epitomizes a commitment to being well-rounded. Today, Dr. Kristine Larson, Professor Emerita of Aerospace Engineering in CU Boulder's Smead Department of Aerospace Engineering, rightfully joins this long list of influential scholars as the 113th Distinguished Research Lecturer. And now I'm pleased to introduce to you the Dean of Engineering, Bobby Braun, who will introduce Professor Larson.
Wow, this is a great crowd. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And Kristine, thank you. This is it's well-deserved recognition for your work, of course, but it's a well-deserved honor for the department and for the college. And you've represented us very well, so thank you. Thank you all again for joining us today to honor Kristine Larson. Professor Larson embodies many of the characteristics of a great engineer. She's female. That's for you guys up front. She has curiosity, tenacity, and an eye towards serving humanity. She applies these characteristics in all that she does, but her specialty is advancing a technology that all of us use daily, GPS, the Global Positioning System. Specifically, she investigates how GPS can shed light on the geosciences in ways that frankly weren't even imagined when GPS was invented. Now you of course know that CU Boulder is #1 in the world in geosciences, and some part of that is due to Kristine Larson's work. Today she'll talk about the applications of GPS in geosciences and in all kinds of other environmental applications that her group has developed. She earned a BS in engineering sciences from Harvard and her PhD in geophysics from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. She joined the Smead Department of Aerospace Engineering Sciences in 1990, and with her colleagues, she has embarked on a wide and diverse set of research projects, from measuring the deformation across the Himalayas to synchronizing atomic clocks, which are the centerpiece of our world's position and navigation systems, to assessing the variability of the Greenland ice sheets, to developing a new technique for measuring seismic waves that can analyze soil moisture, snow accumulation, vegetation, water content, and tides. Her work has been well recognized. She earned the 2014 Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz International Water Prize for creativity. And she's also been inducted into the American Geophysical Union, which many of you know is a premier recognition for a scientist of her caliber, an engineer or scientist of her caliber. One of the things that I imagine Professor Larson will say today is that her career has fortuitously coincided with the GPS revolution. But she's been much more than just a sideline observer to that revolution. Her work has transformed the field and propelled this technology to new frontiers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristine Larson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, is that a good sound in the back? All right. Okay, so no further ado, thank you very much, everyone who introduced me, and thank you to everyone who came. Going to talk about GPS. So I'm going to start out to tell you what I'm going to tell you. First of all, what is geodesy? I am a geodesist, and so we'll talk about why I have this on the outline, mostly because most people don't know what geodesy is, so I want to make sure we start there. And then I'm going to talk about how GPS revolutionized geodesy. It really has, and Bobby is right. It really, GPS has changed completely how geodesy is done and how geoscience has benefited from that. But also, as he said, I've spent a lot of time the last 15 years or so thinking of new ways to do GPS, which I've listed here. And then I want to leave with some comments about the future. So, what is geodesy? Almost every Thanksgiving for the last 25 years, I've been asked what geodesy is and why am I calling myself a geodesist? And sometimes you just give up and say you're a seismologist, I'll admit it. Officially, I wrote down the definition from the dictionary. Geodesy is the science devoted to determining the size, shape, and gravity field of the Earth. And that's exactly what it is. Now, I don't do much with the gravity field, so just think about, if you're talking about measuring the size and the shape of the Earth, you're kind of talking about how high are the highest mountains, how low are the lowest valleys, being able to measure the shape and how it changes. It's not just a sphere, it's not even an oblate spheroid, but all those variations are the kind of things that we do as geodesists. But you can also think about it as just being someone who measures where things are. Because if you're going to say this is the highest mountain, you got to decide on what you mean about where things are. So for you, it's probably just latitude, longitude, and height. It's the kind of thing you see on a map. It's how you know where you are. And that's one of the things geodesy does. Now, I tend to live in this world, this Cartesian world, rather than latitude and longitude and height. And for that, we just talk about the z-axis being through the North Pole and the x-axis being through the Greenwich meridian, which people have heard of, and the y-axis just completes that. But now I'm going to skip something to sort of the historical background of geodesy, because I'm a bit of a history buff. So I'm going to talk about the first modern advance in geodesy, which was in 1617 by a very, very famous Dutch geodesist who proposed a way that we could measure the shape and the form of the Earth. Okay? Now, he was primarily interested in maps and how would you make a precise map. And if you're going to make a map, you have to be able to take a place on the Earth and put it horizontally on the latitudes and longitudes. If you think about it, if this is this mountain, where is its latitude and longitude? So the method is called triangulation. And I've given you context if you haven't seen these before. This is what a triangulation network would look like for his country. This is the building block of that triangulation network. It's not very hard to understand, but it's really been a critical way to measure where we are on a map. Think about yourself with a fancy telescope and you're living in the 1600s, remember? And somebody has nicely put some kind of mirror or some kind of lighting device, and you have this fancy telescope and you measure the angle between these 2 points. And then you quickly run over here and somebody puts the lights on these two, and you again use your fancy telescope to measure this angle. So you've measured 2 angles, and then you spend some money measuring the distance between these 2 points. And if you can remember back to trigonometry or not, just believe me, if you know this distance and you know these 2 angles, you know the other 2 distances, and if you know the latitude and longitude of height of this one, you can basically leapfrog and get the latitude and longitudes of the other 2 red squares. And then you do it over and over and over and over again. So it's a very laborious method. It was used for 400 years, okay? It was a really very clever idea. And it was primarily for map making. But there were some early geoscience applications, incredibly famous geoscience applications, in fact, and I'm going to just share one with you that most of us as Americans are familiar. This is a map that shows you where the 1906 San Francisco earthquake rupture was. That was a huge earthquake that permanently deformed the Earth. And for me, the iconic image is right here, that fence that happened to go through the rupture. All right? So if magically people had put fences all across this 300-kilometer rupture, we could go out with a measuring stick and measure what that rupture was. But of course, they didn't have that. So we have the iconic photos, but basically triangulation can help you understand what happens along this 1906 earthquake rupture, and that's in fact what they did. Some very clever people at the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, which was the map-making organization of the day, they had made triangulation networks in California to make maps. Okay, that was an important thing to do back then. And they went back afterwards. I mean, if you think about it, if you've measured the map once and you don't think the Earth is deforming, there's no reason to ever go back. But they went back because, hey, somebody thought, look, the rupture is right over there. And that rupture isn't just at the fault trace. It deforms a huge region, maybe 50 kilometers each side, maybe 100 kilometers each side. So they knew, or they were curious to know what happened on the other side of the fault. So they repeated the angles. And this plot here, I've referenced this. This was published 10 years ago. People are still using those triangle data to study the 1906 earthquake because that's the information we have about how the Earth deformed. Okay, so geodesy has a lot of older, it has a history, which I enjoy because Bobby's not quite right. I got a BA from Harvard, and part of that was I was taking a lot of history classes. Now, so the other thing I wanted to bring up, because most people know about this, and you may not have heard about, the San Francisco Triangulation Network, but you've heard about Wegener and continental drift. Because most of us in the back of our minds have heard about this theory, and we sure have looked at maps of she's looking closely, Africa and South America, and said, yeah, those do look like they fit together. And sure, that was one of the things that pushed people to combine the information and say, look at the fossil records as well as the shapes, and postulate that our Earth, in fact, is very dynamic and has moved in what we would call geologic time, millions and millions and millions of years. Of course, the 1906 earthquake, that was 2 minutes long. But here we're talking about motions that took place over millions and millions of years. So Wegener had this idea, but had absolutely no way to test that. Okay? You certainly could not use triangles. So it took to the 1960s before the earth sciences had a model, had a way to explain why South America and Africa look like they fit together. And we had predictions, and these predictions were that we have these big plates, which are the different colors, and these red arrows tell you the motion of the plates with respect to each other. And the motions are pretty simple to understand. The plates are either coming together, they're pulling apart, or they're moving horizontally. And California is moving horizontally with respect to each other, all right? So the arrows are telling you the sense of the deformation. They don't tell you the size of the deformation or the changes. But again, how are you going to use geodesy to study whether continental drift is right? I mean, Wegener had this idea, but how do you test that? Well, you have to stop the paradigm of being able to look at what you're measuring. Okay, before, literally, they would put lanterns and mirrors on the tops of church steeples, and they would measure angles. And that's what they did. But the real thing that GPS changed was we no longer had to look at what we were trying to measure. We looked up. So we're no longer going to look at our target. We're going to look at satellites. And so this is the advent of satellite geodesy. And I'm leaving out a little bit of the details, but fundamentally, that's it. We're going to measure the deformation between a GPS receiver in Africa with a GPS receiver in South America. And we're going to agree to track the same GPS satellites, and from that we can back out that in fact the plates are getting further apart every day. It's just a very, very small amount, about that much per year. So we have to be able to do it extremely well. So with GPS, the distance between the two sites suddenly doesn't matter. We can measure motion on tectonic plates anywhere. if we have a GPS receiver on the ground. So this is my one-page cartoon of how GPS works. I forgot to bring my phone. This is how your phone's GPS system is essentially working. I'm using the same system you are. You have signals from multiple GPS satellites, which I'm showing as these blue arrows. Okay, and these are my little cartoons of GPS satellites. This is my little cartoon of a GPS receiver. The big difference between your phone, which has like a $5 GPS receiver in, and mine is this one costs $10,000. So just think of $10,000 and just think, number one, I can measure the blue thing much, much better than your phone because I really, really want to. Because I want to measure those plates pulling apart this much per year. But they're sending down signals, and as Bobby said, they have atomic clocks. And that's going to be extremely helpful. To really understand this system, you're going to have to deal with the fact that, well, the satellites aren't just sitting there, they're orbiting the Earth. So we need to know the orbit of the satellites. We need to know what the clocks are doing in those satellites. We actually need to know what's happening with the atmosphere because we're not in a vacuum. The Earth rotates. There's all these, or as we would say, complications. But that's what satellite geodesy solves, is all these complications. We compute what I do. You compute latitude, longitude, and height as frequently as your phone thinks you need to know it. If it figures out you're in a car, it tries to do it more frequently. For me, and geodesists in the room will laugh, we're willing to sit there very still, measuring where we are very, very precisely. So we're willing to sit there all day, and each day we put out one latitude, longitude, and height measurement, because we want to measure how fast South America and Africa are spreading apart, and we have to be really careful to do that. Now, to do that again, we use tons of measurements, thousands and thousands of measurements per day to put out one point. How well can we do that? Well, I'm going to show you with an example. I showed you the triangulation network for the Netherlands. This is my favorite Dutch GPS site. So again, this is my antenna. Yours, you don't know, well, I mean, you probably assume you have an antenna in your phone. It's some tiny little speck. This is $3,000. And this is each blue dot here. This is a measurement of that point in the Netherlands every day for almost 20 years. That's how well we can measure this plate, this part of the Eurasian plate. So there are blue dots, and then there's some linear fits here. I'm just showing latitude and longitude. We can do the vertical as well, but I just don't have enough space. So the way we turn this into a method to test Wegener's continental drift is, okay, we have 18 years, 32 centimeters east-west. That's 1.78 centimeters per year. Similarly, in the north, it's a little bit slower, so we're that much per year. I work with colleagues all over the world operating these instruments for scientific purposes. We can put all of those measurements together to get this beautiful map of how the Earth's tectonic plates move. So some things to notice is, in fact, Eurasia's moving northeast. The scale bar's down here, so it's about the right magnitude, about 2 centimeters per year. If it looks to you like North America's going counterclockwise, it's going counterclockwise. Eurasia's going clockwise. In this room, the age is such that you know what clockwise means, so that's also a good thing. The length of the arrows tells you how fast it's going. So if you're saying, does that mean there are fast plates and slow plates? That's exactly what it means. So there are fast tectonic plates, slow tectonic plates. They're moving rigidly on a sphere, and the problem is it's a zero-sum game, and at the plate boundaries, that's where you get earthquakes, because that's where those collisions occur. That's where the zero-sum happens. So this kind of map did not exist when I was in graduate school. We simply didn't have this. We learned about Wegener and continental drift without measurements that would confirm it. We also did not have these very dense and visually, well, I think they're beautiful, but these maps with, again, this is 2 centimeters per year. This is Japan. And we're showing the deformation of Japan, which looks crazy complicated. Why? Because these gray lines are plate boundaries. Japan has so many earthquakes because it has the misfortune of being at the boundary of 4 different tectonic plates. I mean, it's bad enough to have one boundary. To have 4 is even more difficult, and that explains why these vectors are going in so many different ways. The other thing GPS revolutionized, in addition to this ability to see how the Earth is deforming at the boundaries, is the effects of earthquakes. And that is what I started with, that picture that showed you how much the fence moved. Well, again, think about it. There were just tons of fences, and we had beautiful GPS receivers to reproduce what that was, we could very precisely measure how each point in the ground moved during the earthquake, and that's sort of what we do. This is a site in Japan. This is before the earthquake. On one day, it moved 65 centimeters. And then afterward, it has this funny motion that I won't talk to you about, but tells you something about the strength of the Earth. So there are 3 things that GPS was supposed to do, as Bobby was alluding to. The big picture, which is plate tectonics. Hopefully we could see the plate boundaries so we would know better what's going on at the plate boundaries. And also we knew that we could see the effects of earthquakes. We could get the before and the after of an earthquake. And if we knew that, we could characterize how big it was, which fault plane slipped, how much, and things like that. And this takes us to about the late 1990s. I'd been at CU for about 10 years, and I kind of had to figure out what to do with myself because I'd been trained to make the blue dots. I had been trained to learn what the blue dots told you about the vectors, which tell you why the Earth ruptures in these earthquakes and why are those plates moving around the Earth the way they are. And, I really enjoyed it. But at some point, you have to decide, am I going to be the person that uses the vectors and uses the blue dots to explain the Earth's mechanical structure and why it behaves the way it does? Or am I going to try to make the blue dots better? And I picked the blue dots. So I'm not maybe making that sound as exciting as it is, but I decided I wanted to make GPS better. And it was kind of a conscious decision. And I also kind of wanted to maybe that was more of my engineering side. I liked solving problems. So what I'm going to talk to you now is sort of what I've been doing for the last 15 years. I started out in the GPS revolution, if you will, where all of a sudden we could measure things that couldn't be measured. And the first thing I tasked myself with was based on a recommendation or request of a seismologist. He said, the seismometers fail during earthquakes. I know you don't believe that, but that's what he told me. And what he meant was a seismometer next to a rupture fails. Seismometers here can easily measure the seismic waves from Alaska, but if you're right on top of the rupture, that's where they fail. He said, if you could get a GPS receiver to put out an answer every second, that would help me. So I said, well, I don't know. There's this big black arrow of empty space where if you measure where the ground is once per day, you don't see what happens during an earthquake. You just get the before and the after. So what I wanted to do was see what happened during the earthquake. Why would you want to do this? As I said, some seismometers don't work properly when they're close to a rupture, particularly for the large ones. And why? I don't want to look at the little ones, I want to look at the big ones. So that's a yay. We could supplement seismometers. I was never looking to replace seismometers. I was just trying to make it better where we could. And the point was also that my friends that put all those arrows on the surface of the Earth were already running GPS instruments. So that means we might be able to use them to study earthquakes during the earthquake without spending any extra money. And that's useful. Okay, this is what we saw. It doesn't maybe look so exciting, but it's very exciting to me. Because now each one of the blue dots is 1 second. So instead of having the wealth of 1 day's worth of data to average, now every second stands alone. I can't average because I want to know the ground motion every second. And what probably should jump out at you is it's pretty darn smooth. There's this big, huge motion here, and then it settles down, and that's basically telling you the earthquake's over. But it tells you what are called the dynamic motions, which are during the earthquake, but it also gives you the before and after picture that we had before. So it tells you, I would say, everything. That was a magnitude 8 earthquake. That was the largest earthquake in 2003. This was almost the largest earthquake of the century is of this century. This is the Tohoku, Japan earthquake in 2011. Forget about 65 centimeters. This is 5 meters of permanent displacement that took place in less than a minute. Okay? The seismometers failed here on second 5. Okay? That's just too big for them. Certain kinds of seismometers. And you can see that it went south and down. GPS has no problem with these signals. I'm going to show you a video because everybody likes videos. I just want to show you these are all during this earthquake. Here's the scale bar. This will be the horizontal motions. This is a meter, and this is 50 centimeters. It's going to look jittery because that's what things do. It's measuring its motion every second. You see that's when the earthquake happens. It takes a little while for the waves to get to Japan. And then you're going to see these huge oscillations. And the thing that's distinctive is the GPS vectors never go back to where they were. You know, when you see those drums on the TV, those are showing you accelerations. As soon as the earthquake's over, the accelerations go to 0. We're measuring permanent ruptures. Okay? And all of this part of Japan also subsided. There's actually a magnitude 8. That's the aftershock, which is still a really huge signal. So we did this. So I'm pretty happy about that we worked on that. I'm going to go back to where I was. This is a trick that we engineers and scientists use to make ourselves look perfectly. What perfect is, you see how this is like 9 meters on the y-axis, and it looks like before the earthquake I can measure something perfectly. That doesn't look like there's any imprecision. That's because of the scale bar. If you zoom in on it, which we did, you see something that looks like this, and this silver line is, quote, the correct answer. There's no earthquake. Nothing should be moving the ground. I'm telling you that. You should just believe me. So everything you're seeing in blue is an error source that I haven't dealt with appropriately. Okay? And my group and I spent a lot of time looking at these. We knew what caused these things that look kind of like oscillations, right? They're not perfect oscillations, but they look like they're oscillations. We knew what caused them, but we really had to figure out what to do with them. What causes them is one of the error sources I didn't tell you about was that GPS signals, it's not like they know exactly where you are, right? If my head is the antenna, sure, you get signals at your head, but there's also going to be signals that hit surfaces near you, reflect off that surface, and arrive at your head or antenna late. So there are these bounces, or reflections, or engineers called it multipath because it takes more than one path. So we knew about these oscillations, but no one likes them. They're always considered bad, or I used to always consider them to be bad. We worked for a long time, my group, and Penny Axelrad is here, also worked with me on this. The way to get rid of those oscillations for seismic applications is to take into account that we know the GPS orbit. And we know that these things are caused by reflections from surfaces below the antenna. So if the orbits, if we can predict where the satellite is and figure out where it is to produce the same ground reflection, then we can remove it. So it's the fact that we know the repetition of the orbit that brought us to this idea of, say, what do I have here? Blue is Monday, so I have those oscillations. Tuesday are the same oscillations taking into account the orbit. And you can see that those things that were making my seismic data look bad, they can be removed. Because if the earthquake's on Tuesday, I just use Monday to remove those, and what's left over is the earthquake. So that was the big thing we worked on in the 2003 to 2007. But I was on a sabbatical, and it just kind of like, when this sabbatical's over, I really should look at those bounces to see if I can do something with them to tell me about the surface. So that was when we turned things upside down. Because those reflections, how strongly they bounced, the frequency with which they bounced, that should tell me something about whether the ground is wet or dry, whether there's snow on the ground, whether there's vegetation on the ground. And that was the big idea of turning things upside down. I'm never exactly sure if that makes me an engineer or a scientist. I've always kind of been in the middle. But I knew my instrument, I saw something I didn't understand. Okay, then I understood it. I got rid of it. Wait, maybe I could do something useful with it. So that's the scenario. This also meant I started working with hydrologists and snow scientists and water managers and eco-scientists and even farmers. So those are the people that are going to care whether the ground is wet, whether there's snow on the ground, and whether there's vegetation. And again, you have to ask yourself, just with the seismometers, you don't want to build a newfangled instrument that no one wants, okay? So there's value in this because it would supplement other sensors for measuring soil moisture and snow depth, mostly that the satellites are measuring areas that are too large. And some of the in situ instruments, the ones that are in the ground, are too small. Most snow sensors are this big. Those of you who've walked outside know that measuring snow in this area is not as big as how much snow is in a football field. But it's also not the same as a field that's 40 kilometers on a side. And that's what a satellite measures. So there's some value in using GPS, and it's inexpensive, which is a good thing. Because we can use all the GPS receivers that my friends in geodesy and tectonics have put out there to measure snow or soil moisture. The other thing that was really fortunate for me was I had this idea at about the time that NSF built a very large GPS array. It's actually organized and operated by a group here, local group called UNAVCO. This was called the Plate Boundary Observatory. And you can see, yes. Okay, we're still putting instruments right on the San Andreas Fault because we're still trying to understand it. So most of the instruments were in California. But you can see there were also instruments here at the Yellowstone volcano. So we're going to measure, I'm going to try to use this to do environmental science. So this has been installed to measure plate motions and faulting. So the first thing I'm going to show you is measuring snow. Turned out we were able to measure snow at 220 sites. I'm going to show you a little video that just shows you my attempt to measure snow juxtaposed with a little picture. Because the people at UNAVCO, at my request, helped us out they posted a camera that took a picture of this pole. I don't know why they used the English system. That was one of the... but we digitized, or student digitized this pole every day. And so the student had a measure from the photo of how much snow was at that pole. And then I had the GPS data, and I could look at the frequencies in the reflection data. So we're going to update this once a week just to show you what's going on. The site's in Idaho. This is when I found out it's very cloudy in Idaho when we looked at this video. How'd we do? We did extremely well. I mean, think about the fact that the pole is here, and I'm measuring something more or less the size of a football field, because I'm looking at reflections in all directions, not as big as a football field, 30 meters of radius. The other beauty of this is, remember I showed you that 18-year time series? Geodesists love long time series. So that means I can go back into the data archives and measure snow, 12 or 13 years, just by using the same data that my colleagues are using to measure plate motions and to measure crustal deformation. So it gives you an opportunity to measure time-varying snow depth. We also measured soil moisture, which was important. It's an important parameter for atmospheric models and for climate models. Mostly what we're doing, it's not so much that, yes, it rains, the ground gets wet, okay? I used to have to explain that at Thanksgiving too. But the thing that's important is how fast it dries. So what I'm showing here in blue is the ground got wet, but the important thing is how fast did it dry? Because how fast it dries, we know it depends on the temperature of the air, but it also depends on the soil and how much water's in the soil. So these are data used by climate scientists and atmospheric scientists. I mean, I was really shocked because I was ignorant. Atmospheric sciences, they're the ones who want this data because they need it for what they're doing. And for vegetation, this is my all-time favorite site in Wyoming. Why do I like this site? Well, here I'm showing you in blue. So forget about the axes. The blue just means plant is growing, plant is dying, plant is growing, plant is dying. Just that should be the mantra. What's shown below is sort of an average. How much does it rain every year, including snow? And then red is that year. And sure enough, no rain or snow, the vegetation never grows. And again, this is using GPS plate tectonic data to measure vegetation water content. The other thing I thought was kind of fun, because that's the way I am, is these double peaks. I just found them fascinating. You know, the vegetation starts to grow, it doesn't rain, so it starts to die, but then it gets a lot of rain, and it goes back up, and it comes back down. And we have a daily measurement instead of the more typical optical measurement, which is every 2 weeks. And again, geodesists like to make measurements all the time. So you could look at drought, you can look at, in this case, I'm measuring sort of a ratio. Hot means dead vegetation. So just think of blue as being healthy vegetation, red is drought-stricken vegetation. And you can see that this California drought that we heard about it was several years and got worse and worse before it improved, and now, of course, it's bad again. But I didn't know that there was an equally bad drought 10 years ago. Okay. And then the irony of all ironies is soil moisture is very hard to measure. We started with soil moisture first. If I had realized that measuring tides would be so much easier, I sort of wish I'd started with tides. But if you're going to reflect off a nice smooth surface, what looks smoother than that? That looks nice and smooth. Why would you measure tides or water levels with GPS? And I was told by many people that we don't need another tide gauge, which is fine. But it turns out tide gauges may be better at measuring the water level relative to the sensor, but the sensor's anchored to the earth at some point. And if that anchor on the earth is not perfect, you're not measuring sea level, you're measuring sea level plus the motion of the anchor. So imagine you're in New Orleans. Do you think there are many good anchors in New Orleans? No, the whole place is subsiding. Fennoscandia, Sweden and Norway is all still rebounding from ice sheets 10,000 years ago. So any tide gauge from Sweden has to be corrected for the local ground motion. Well, I'm a GPS receiver, so that takes care of that. So it is a nice system for that particular problem. And then actually one person who kind of poo-pooed my idea did admit that one nice thing about the GPS tide gauge is it's not in the water. all other tide gauges are in water, salt water. So I'm out here, because that's how GPS instruments work. I'm going to show you results from Kachemak Bay in Alaska. A friend of mine runs this site because he's trying to measure millimeter per year vertical subsidence. Turns out they have 8-meter tides in Alaska, 8 meters peak to peak. Just by looking at the reflections, we can measure, as we're showing here in blue, the tides. And in magenta, I'm showing you what I call, air quote, real tide gauge. There's really we're real now, because they look the same, and we have the added advantage, we can measure the ground motion going up and down. But I like titles like accidental tide gauge, so that was for fun. And then again, it turned out, I'm just showing you this for fun, this is a site in Alaska as well. This again was a UNAVCO site for the Plate Boundary Observatory, and I like it because it's so pretty, but it's 300 meters above sea level, but we're measuring tides with it. Okay, so there. And then the last thing I was going to show you are GPS signals will reflect off ice sheets if it's smooth enough. So I'm going to show you some results from the GLISTEN network, which was installed by a bunch of seismologists, actually. And UNAVCO had this website that showed me where data were, and I just why are there GPS receivers on the on the Greenland ice sheet? Just seemed like a crazy thing. But I talked to the people that installed the site. This is in 2011. And they explained to me that they had a 3 or 4 meter pole below that wooden monument, if you will. and then it was 3 or 4 meters above, and it's so tall because they know it snows a lot, okay, in Greenland. So they had to make it so they could make the pole taller and taller if it snowed a lot. So that's what it looked like in 2011. They took pictures every year, and then I've juxtaposed them. I've used these magenta lines to connect the twisty ties. This is in 2012. Do you see how that box is well above the ice sheet? The entire ice sheet in 2012 melted. First time in modern period, I believe. And then over the years, and this is like, I used to see these guys at meetings, and I'd say, yeah, gotta go make that pole taller, because it's about to snow under, and they did. And so we've corrected for that, but what we have, again, the GPS site was installed to measure the speed of the ice sheet. It wasn't installed to measure how much snow was there. But we have, from this 8-year time series, 9-year time series, of the snow accumulation. Now there's that big melt. I mean, that was a big, big melt. These are, every summer it melts, almost. It didn't melt this summer. We had a very hot summer in Europe, well, also here, but in Europe. It wasn't hot in Greenland. And so it didn't melt last year very much. Okay. I think I'm okay on my timing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. There you go. So the people at UNAVCO will appreciate this. So I'm very excited. I couldn't think of a clever thing to call it, so I'm just calling it deliberate GPS reflectometry. So I've spent the last 10 years using other people's instruments to measure snow and soil moisture and vegetation water content and tides, but no one ever put the instruments where I wanted them. So the people at UNAVCO asked me, and they were very accommodating. They operate the GPS site because GPS is just useful. They need it for all sorts of things. They in fact use it, I think, to help with airplane surveys that they do. They need the extra information from a ground site, but they were nice enough to put the GPS site at the top of a 16-meter tower. And the reason that is useful is because you have this beautifully, forget about 30-meter radius, now we're talking 500-meter. That's more useful to climate scientists than 30 meters. Antarctica, they have now installed 3, and I believe they're putting in a 4th. They put a GPS site, it's way up there. They didn't put the pole in for me, but they put the GPS site up there. So it's 30 meters tall. That's a kilometer across from side to side. And these 2 sites went in, I think last year, they just had their first year's birthday. So they're there to measure snow accumulation. It's hard to measure snow accumulation in Antarctica. Diane can tell you about that. So here's a system that's not 1 meter. It's tens and tens of meters from side to side. So I think it's really, it's really nice for me to see something I developed to use these bad data, and now people are deploying things on purpose. So the last thing the last thing I have on this future part is another UNAVCO installation. Again, I didn't install this, but it's put together, I think it's a nonprofit organization, the Ocean Observing System in Alaska. But you can tell people have talked to me because you notice how the antenna is a little bit taller than usual. Most GPS antennas are this tall. Why? Because that's how tall people are. And they don't want to have ladders to do maintenance. So this one's taller than a typical person because it gives us a better view of the water. And instead of having 30 measurements per day or 40 measurements per day, now we have 350 because it's put in a good place. And as I mentioned here without telling you, I was there at the beginning of GPS. It was a great thing to get involved in as a grad student, but it's not a GPS world anymore. It's a GPS plus a Russian system, plus a European system, plus a Chinese system. So instead of having 30 satellites, I've got 120. They're all free signals, and maybe Great Britain will be having one too. They've pulled out of Galileo. Anyway, I'm just not kidding, but sad. Again, it's not a better tide gauge than currently exists, but it measures ground motion, it's easy to operate, and it's robust in the cryosphere. So those are good things. All right. Finishing up, whatever happened to GPS seismology? I mean, I've been off in hydrology land for the last 10 years. So what happened after I left the field? I was just excited to measure seismic displacements during earthquakes. That was one of the funnest things I've ever done. And part of that was because I'd always wanted to be a seismologist. Smart people at the University of Washington, Caltech, Scripps Institution of Oceanography are doing it now in real time, and they're contributing to real-time earthquake early warning measurements. I mean, what could be better than that? It's already in society being used right now for little earthquakes, but this is a study they did in Chile, which had a magnitude 8 earthquake a few years ago. There are also some people that are interested in using your phones. Now, your phones aren't good enough to measure plate tectonics, but they are good enough for large earthquakes. If you could get those teenagers to download the data, now we have lots of data to study earthquakes. So that's a really cool thing. So my last 2 slides from my technical part are, this is what we hope to do with GPS, was to measure plate tectonics on the left and the really exciting ways that plate boundary deformation occurs. This happens to be western US. But along the way, we figured out how to measure seismic waves, vegetation water content, snow accumulation in the cryosphere, soil moisture. I haven't talked about ash detection, but I've worked on that too. And we've developed a new tide gauge. So that's my, yay, last slide of that. I do want to, I figure I have a captive audience, so, okay, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people, so I'm not going to thank every single person that I've worked with over the years, but I picked 3 people that were there at an important time to me. One is Jim Rice, who was my PhD advisor. No, wasn't my PhD advisor. He was my undergraduate advisor at Harvard. And just will always be grateful to him for being so supportive. It was not 50% female in engineering at Harvard. I think I was one of 3 women in the major. John Moore, some of you may know, is just he was the greatest geodesist of his age, really he was. And he was here at the University of Colorado, and he was a joy to work with. He really was. And then Jay Fine, I didn't work with him, but a colleague of mine brought him to one of my seminars, and he funded our first soil moisture work. And I still have the reviews for our NSF proposal that said we were nuts and it would never work. And he was the atmospheric sciences program manager, and he gave us a chance. So, and then, went on to be funded with other programs as well. And then the other thing I wanted to do was finish up with just the family slide. On the left, these are my grandparents, my paternal grandparents. They lived in Barrow, Alaska in 1949. So how crazy is that? That's because they were extracting oil. My mom and dad are in the top right there. And when I was looking for a photo of them, of course, we didn't run around with phones we didn't have phones with cameras, so that's part of the problem. I don't have a lot of pictures of my parents together because they were so busy taking pictures of us. And that's the kind of parents they were, so they cared about us. And then, if you don't know them, that is my son, Radon, and my husband, George. And then, finally, that's my picture that I took on vacation in April. So, thank you very much. So I think the way we decided to do this is I'll repeat your question because it makes it easier for the people that are taping it, if there are any. Yes?
How do you measure, how do you take a measurement in the middle of the ocean?
Yeah, you need an altimeter for that. That's not exactly true, but the revolution, Oh, yeah, I forgot to do what I said I'd do. So how do you measure things that are happening in the oceans? And for that, I mean, oceanography has benefited from satellite geodesy using altimetry, and they're measuring where the surface of the ocean is for that. I would say, I don't think you were asking about it, but the short story is, if you put kind of I'm going to call it a monument, but if you put this big thing in the bottom of the ocean, and then you put transponders to talk to 3 GPS buoys on the surface of the ocean, you can back out, you figure out where the buoys are, using GPS, of course, and then you use the transponders to tell you where the thing at the bottom of the crust is underneath all that water. And really the most fabulous results from the Tohoku earthquake, although I think the GPS was fabulous, the Japanese did that. They had measured grounds, they'd measured points on the ocean floor before the earthquake. Afterwards, they went back out with the ocean buoys and the transponders. And you, I hope, were kind of shocked that 5 meters, 20 feet, 18, 20 meters. 20 meters offshore. I mean, these are massive earthquakes that hit Japan. So altimeters, and also, this is called seafloor geodesy. It's very expensive, though, because of the ships. Yeah?
So you must have just vast amounts of data. Can you tell us a little bit about where you keep the data and how you keep track of it?
So the question was, you must have tons of data. How do you keep track of it, and where is it? So when I was a child, I used to get floppy disks in the mail. And then, when I got older, I got 9-track tapes in the mail. And then the internet happened. It was just so wonderful. So the other thing is, I haven't talked about it too much, but geodesists are very friendly and collaborative. We don't recognize we don't recognize country boundaries. We work together because we're all trying to study the Earth. We don't care where the country boundaries are, so we share data. And so we developed systems of international archives that have freely available public data. So, for example, as UNAVCO knows, I sometimes think they have my picture on a dartboard there. I keep all my data with them, and I just process the data where I am, and then I delete the raw data. Because I know they're professional archivists and will keep track of the terabytes. So I use what I need, and snow depth is one number, but 100 megabytes went into that. 100 megabytes, what comes out is 78 centimeters, or something like that. So really it's because we have professional archives. I think that's the answer, is you have centrally located, at least for scientists, you have centrally located archives that share data. I think that's the answer. Yeah, Jeff?
Do you see any possibility to use CubeSats to study solid
Oh, so like to make GPS?
and other planets?
Other planets. Yeah, that would be cool. I've heard about people, it was in my Twitter feed today, talking about doing that on the moon. But I mean, obviously, maybe Penny would correct me. I don't think you have to have billion-dollar satellites to do everything GPS does. Certainly people are thinking about doing it with smaller, lighter satellites. I think I'd be silly to say that's not on the list of ideas. We've seen so many, I mean, at least for the science applications, I didn't talk about radial occultation. I don't know if the people from UCAR are here, but they are certainly going that way, putting GPS. We certainly put GPS receivers in space all the time. I don't know as much about putting transmitters in space, but I've got to think you could do something that would be cheaper. Yes?
Are there good reasons for different countries to have different GPS, or is it just confidence?
I don't know if that's going to ruin the, it's a pride thing. I mean, if you were in China, would you want to rely on GPS? And if you were Russian, would you want to use an American navigation system? So one of the reasons, I mean, I don't think that's unfair to say, is people don't want to rely on an American navigation system. basically at all. I mean, that at the bottom of it, and I understand that. But I'm sorry, I won't say that. Okay, I won't talk about Brexit. But I've watched them all get their act together, and I am really grateful that the U.S. built and maintains that constellation. It's a beautiful piece of technology, and I'm happy that now we can use the Russian systems and the Chinese systems and the European systems. But the reason they build them is because they want to control them. Okay.